All right, does anybody have any questions before we start today? What's going on Monday? Exam number 1. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here once we get in to things. I got just a few wrap-up things on unemployment to do, and then we'll probably have a little time for a short review session of sorts, just to at least get a flyby of the material. So let's see. Last time we left off thinking about unemployment, which was one of the big 3. So I want you to think about the big 3 again. What were those 3 things? Real GDP, inflation, and unemployment. Okay, good. So those are the things we need to know pretty well for the test. These early chapters 4 and 5, we're learning how to measure these things. We're not really getting into the prediction business about what it is. We're just kind of learning what they are, how we measure them. We left off with unemployment and thinking about why people are unemployed. And we came up with a laundry list of things. So look at that list. What were some of those things of why people were not working or unemployed? I guess unemployed is what we were narrowing it down to, which there's a difference we learned between not working and unemployed. Let me start there. What's the distinct thing that needs to be going on for somebody who's not working to be considered unemployed? They have to want to work, and they're actively looking as another condition. So they have to be doing something to be actively seeking employment. Okay, so what was on that list then of reasons why people were unemployed? Seasonal, laid off, quit, new entrants, new technology. So we had a number of different reasons. Yeah, we had the outsourcing on there. And so what we're starting off with today is 3 types of unemployment. Three types of unemployment. One is frictional. Frictional unemployment. So this is unemployment due to natural turnover in the market. They were some of the things we had on our list that you just went through. So those new entrants into the market, new entrants to the labor force. This has been an interesting thing that's taken on a real world aspect the last year or so in the United States. Is we had some people who kind of gave up looking for work. They're just like, there's no hope. I've been doing this for a year and a half. This sucks. And so they kind of gave up hope and they quit looking. As soon as they quit looking, guess what? They're not unemployed anymore, right? So they're just kind of disgusted, disgruntled about the whole system. And if they're not looking, they are not unemployed. So as the economy started to pick up and we started to see some glimmers of hope, the unemployment rate sometimes went up, even though there was some positive signs about the economy. Why? Because the labor force grew. So the formula we had here for the unemployment rate, U, was the fraction of unemployed compared to the labor force. So as we start to have more people enter the labor force, but not working, that can have opposite effects for the unemployment rate that we'd expect. So it's a balance between people leaving and coming into the labor force. All of which is fairly natural to be happening. So natural churning. So new entrants to the labor force can cause some frictional. The voluntary quits, take this job and shove it. People doing that because they want to find a new job, but they don't have the other one lined up. So all of that is just this what we call frictional unemployment. All right, so number 2 is structural unemployment. Structural unemployment. These are the people that got squeezed out because of technology. So their skills have become obsolete. So unemployed because skills are obsolete or don't match the local market. I wanted to add that little piece on there. The main thing is here, skills becoming obsolete. They're not needed anymore. You're the best VCR repairman, but we don't need VCR repairmen anymore. So you find yourself out of a job. New technology changes, whatever. It's also possible that your skills don't match the market in a particular area. So you've been living in Ottawa for the last 20 years, and you have, I don't know, let's say, might be a bad example, but nursing skills. We got one hospital in Ottawa and you've worked there. The hospital shuts down and goes out of business because there's not enough sick people, or they're all running up to Lawrence or to other places. So now you have some skills. You find yourself unemployed because they're not right there in your local market. And by gosh, you've never left Franklin County and you're not going to leave. And so you're like, what do I do now? I'm unemployed. You have some skills, but they don't match what's there in the current environment. So you need to maybe branch out and move to a different part of the country, a different county, a different place. That can be a mismatch that's got a structural issue to it. All right, so we got technology working here, natural turnover here. Our last category is cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment. So this is unemployment that's due to the ups and downs of the economy, but obviously the downs, so is where we get unemployed. So due to recession. And more generally, we could say just the ups and downs. So the economy tends to cycle. One of the things we need to know for the test Monday is the 4 phases of the business cycle. If we're measuring real GDP over time, there's a connection between unemployment and real GDP. Right? So as the economy expands in an expansion phase, how's unemployment doing? Getting bigger or smaller? Smaller. So I got a job, I lost my job. I got a job, I lost my job. I got a job, I lost my job. And so that type of unemployment isn't very healthy. And the question with that comes in is there ways to smooth out the cycle? So imagine if we were somehow able to stay on this 3% trend, but smooth out the ride. This is a concept we'll come back to more than once. Let's see, I guess I'll use this. What if we were having an up like that, and then we shave off the downs, we got up, we go down. On average, we're growing the same, but we had less of a cycle. It was more stable and predictable. That would be more desirable than the rocky road, which makes cyclical unemployment kind of a bad type of unemployment. All right, so we're not operating at our potential. We just happen to be in a low period. If we were in a high period, you'd be working. It has nothing to do with your skills. Your skills are still needed in the labor force. You want to work. It's not just something that's we had come to expect through normal labor market turnover. So it's not so hot. So what do we pull from this? When we go back to our big three goals, is our goal 0% unemployment? It's impossible, but is it our goal? So I heard it's impossible, but is it our goal? Why do you say no? Well, let's tackle that. I heard some no's back there.
That takes out the competition for jobs for people who like to work hard and be good at their job.
True, but probably not determining whether that's our goal or not.
So do you not have natural turnover? People are just staying in the actual job that they have constantly for the rest of their life.
So is this a sign of a healthy economy or a bad economy? Healthy, growing, vibrant economy. A lot of good comes up with seeing natural turnover. People who are sick and tired of their job and move on to something else. They're not a good fit at that particular company, so they quit and reallocate themselves to some other place. That's good, that's healthy for the economy. So if we have a goal of 0%, we'd be denying that. We'd be trying to say, well, it's better if you stay in that job, even if you don't like it, even if you're not good at it, just stay there because we want to keep the unemployment as low as possible. It doesn't make sense, right? So a healthy economy has this, so there's some level greater than 0 that we'd expect.
When is that percent perfect? Like when is it too high?
When is it perfect? The golden question. I'll come back to that in a second. Let me come back to this one. Structural. Healthy for the economy, again, kind of stepping back from the big picture. Healthy, right? Technological change. We got changes. We're meeting new needs that we didn't think were there before. People are learning how to use computers. They're accessing the internet. Things change. Things evolve. That's healthy for the economy. And so that then adds on to this amount. So we've got frictional being kind of not only good, but expected of a healthy, growing economy. Expected of a healthy, growing economy. You better have some frictional unemployment. You better have some structural unemployment as well if you've got a good, healthy, growing economy. Cyclical, on the other hand, is not necessarily good. This is kind of the bad one. Here we've got, for whatever reason, due to the ups and downs of things, if we could smooth things out, we wouldn't have as big of issues if we could stabilize things a little better. So this is more of the bad part. All right, so our goal then is to figure out the natural rate. the natural rate of unemployment. That should really be our goal.
Is that
Now,
full unemployment is zero?
when, no, not, I'm not sure I heard you.
Cyclical unemployment.
When cyclical, yeah, well, when it's balanced out at least. When we have only these two good forms, yes. So the natural rate of unemployment is the level of unemployment that exists when we have only the good ones, frictional and structural. So conceptually, I'm using U subscript n to describe the natural rate of unemployment, and that is when we have only frictional and structural. Now, if you ask 100 economists, it's likely you'll get 100 different answers. Is the level of frictional unemployment something you can calculate very easily? You know, did you lose your job because you suck at your job, or because your skills are obsolete, or because your company is slumping? Is your company slumping because the general economy is slumping, or because you're getting phased out and there's increased competition and you're not as good as what you used to do before? There's a big blurry line between these. So conceptually we can think of them being good, but to actually identify what that is would be more difficult. So the best I can leave you with here is that I'd say the vast majority of economists would probably say that this lies somewhere in the 5 to 6% range. There'd be some other economists that might dip down to 4.5, somewhere in the 4s. I don't think any economist would say it's down as low as 3. So at least we got kind of a general idea of that range, which means today's level of 7.6% is too high, right? There's definitely some cyclical unemployment still in our economy, and so we're trying to see when are we going to get back to that natural rate of unemployment where we're fully utilizing all of our resources. Some of those people might need to move. A lot of people have. When the recession first hits, when they lose their job, their reaction is, oh, well, I'll just find another job at another business in Kansas City. That might not happen when a big recession hits. They might have to relocate to find new skills, and as the economy evolves, it might take a while to say, oh, I really have to relocate to somewhere else to where I can get the level of income that I think I should be making, if that's the case, if it's income related, taking into consideration lots of other things besides income too. Okay, questions or comments on that? So make sure you put an X through that, by the way. Yes?
In the book, it talked about full employment. Would that be the natural rate?
Yes. So when the economy's operating at the natural rate, for argument's sake, let's say it's 5%. So if the economy's at a 5% unemployment rate, we say that the economy is operating at full employment. So full employment of society's resources. So if we're using our resource base as efficiently as possible, we expect there to be some unemployment. So we're saying the economy is fully employed at when the unemployment rate is the natural rate. So let me write that down. So note, when the economy is at an unemployment rate equal to, so the actual unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate. So let's put in parentheses the natural rate of unemployment. When the economy is at the natural rate of unemployment, the economy is said to be at full employment. couple key concepts that will carry through the rest of the semester. This whole natural rate, the full employment rate. And so deviation from the natural rate is cyclical, right? So even if it's the unemployment rate's at 4.5%, some economists would say, well, that's not sustainable. I think the natural rate is 5.5, and so it's just because we're on an upward surge in the economy, right? It's kind of overheating, and it's possible then to be employed beyond what we'd expect it to be in the long run. Okay, any other questions there? Wanted to call out a couple other labor measures that we didn't write down before. We talked about the guts of them. So one of them's the labor force participation rate. Labor force participation rate. That is equal to, and let's just write out these formulas and then we'll kind of work through the logic of why they might be interesting. The labor force divided by the WAP. What was the WAP again? Working age population. So how old did you have to be? 16. So labor force participation rate. And then I also want to look at the employment to population ratio. Employment to population ratio. And that is the number of people employed. The number of people employed by the WAP. All right, so these are pieces of the puzzle that we talked about before, but they kind of help tell a bit of a story. What story might they tell here as it relates to the recession and maybe some of the issues that we even talked about earlier? Labor force participation rate. So if that ends up being 60%, what's it telling you? Are able to work and are working or searching. So remember, labor force has the unemployed and the employed. And then there's this pool of people that are greater than 16 years of age. So it kind of hints at like the potential. Like, how is the labor force going to maybe morph over time? And how is that variable changing? Do we see people leaving the household and getting daycare providers so both mom and dad enter the labor force, right? So they were a member of the working age population. Both of them were. Maybe historically only one would be in the labor force and the other one would be at home. So you can see how this ratio might change over time culturally if both mom and dad go to work now, right? So you can see how that fraction tells you a little bit of the story of what's going on in the United States and the macroeconomy in terms of labor potential. Over here, we've got the number of people employed versus that working age population. So how many people are gainfully employed compared to the population of the whole? So just kind of ways to look at the data in a kind of a snapshot and start to pull together pieces. All right, questions or comments there? There's a picture from your textbook that kind of shows you a little bit of what I just said. If you're measuring time and look at the male labor force participation from 1961 to today, this particular one I have the old, I think this is from a different version, but through basically present day, and we look at labor force participation, males look like that. some males choosing to stay at home. Females look like this. So we just start to be able to tell a story about the demographics in the nation by looking at some of these data points.
Is that important to the population ratio, the different, like, is it the population minus the employment rate?
It is the number of people working, so it's a fraction of, it's the employment rate, right, essentially. I mean, it's the employment rate uses the labor force here, right? So it's number employed divided by the labor force. So now we're dividing by the bigger population. Just another statistic, really, just depending on what thing you are trying to
So
evaluate.
it's not the difference between, like, that plus the unemployment rate,
Oh.
it won't add up to 100?
No, no, I don't think so. There's
Okay, just 'cause
probably
you're dividing it by the-
there's probably some formula that we could force something out of, but all right. I think you can pretty much draw a line in your notes there that is about it for the test for material. So the remainder of the hour here, I'd like to spend a little bit of time reviewing and talking about the test. So the exam will be in class here during our normal class time. Chapters, I might as well write this down here. Chapters 1, 2, 15, 4, and 5. Okay. So see your syllabus for other details. It's a combination of multiple choice and short answer. I am going to be emailing out a kind of a practice set that I strongly encourage you to practice. Those of you who had me for micro, it'll be kind of similar in nature, so there'll be some problems that you guys can work on and work through. They'll be similar potentially to some of the short answer problems, but the test has multiple choice and short answer. So don't put all your efforts into that, because the test usually is weighted roughly 70%-ish here and 30%-ish here. So I think I've had students before who kind of hit this hard and heavy and put all their study efforts into that, but then they missed out on 70% of the points. So you got to find a balance there. So hopefully you've been keeping up with your homework. Go back and review the homework problems. On My Econ Lab, you can generate practice multiple choice problems. You can generate exam sample test questions. And those are a great way to study for the multiple choice. There's also a flashcard function on My Econ Lab. So there's lots of study tools that you guys can kind of navigate through and tailor your studying accordingly to what works. Any questions on that so far? All right, so chapters 1, 2, 15, 4, and 5. So, basic intro to econ stuff here in chapter 1 and 2. We talked about Adam Smith, the market system, and then chapter 2 got into our first economic model, the production possibilities curve. So thinking about those trade-offs, your book has a nice example of two people that are trying to run a business of ice cream and something or other, I can't remember. And then we went into chapter 15, which is really a takeoff of chapter 2, the first material we did. So on 2 and 15 is kind of a combo when I did the United States and Japan. that is really a production possibilities curve exercise on showing the advantages to mutually beneficial trade and exchange. That's what economics is all about. So those things are certainly important on your bucket material here that Tom and Jen on the island, if you read through the text there, that gives hopefully a good rundown. You should really understand what's going on with all of that. We spent quite a bit of time in class thinking about production possibilities and then ultimately consumption possibilities that are greater than what we can do ourselves. Those are the gains from trade. That's what it's all about. Chapter 15 then went into some market stuff with the more international trade topics were tariffs, quotas, and then issues regarding trade restrictions. Why do we have winners and losers? Which kind of looked at the question of why people tend to complain about free trade. The winners' wins outweigh the losers' losses globally, but somebody always gets hurt and somebody always gets helped within each country. So those were some important lessons. Tariffs were taxes on imports. Quotas were quantity restrictions. So one tip is thinking about our eyeball trick. I think that kind of helped bring a number of different issues into play. You saw different applications of that in your homework where you might have just been presented a supply and demand curve in a particular country. So I'm going to start with presenting it not the way I did it in class, which reminds me all of these lectures, if you want to go back, well, there was one that was missing, I think, was this class. But most of the lectures except one are on the Russ Econ Rocks, the YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and review a couple sections of things you didn't quite get, you can go in and look at that again. So without any trade, if we're the only country out there, if we are Germany, then our German beer is going to sell for a certain amount of dollars to German residents, German consumers. So supply equals demand, gives us the good old-fashioned home base here that we know and love. And if this is the quantity of beer, we've got German consumers being satisfied with their thirst by German producers. Things get kind of interesting when we open up to the rest of the world. How do we know whether Germany has a comparative advantage in beer? How are we going to know that? What's one little clue? Their price compared to the world price. Okay, now which direction did that go? So if the world is consuming beer at $9, then they don't. And if the world price is $15, they do. So what you want to start thinking about is the price reflects the cost and how efficient you are at it. If you end up being able to provide the good at a price of $12, it means that that's your cost of doing business as well. And so if the rest of the world is trading beer at $15, you may have a comparative advantage in that good. You're good at it relative to the rest of the world. Why? I don't know. What's your resources? Do you got good equipment? Do you got mountain spring water that makes good beer? I don't know. Whatever. You've got some sort of resource base, some sort of combination of buckets that allows your country to make beer cheaper than the rest of the world. You have a comparative advantage. So the answer to that problem comes from the world market that your textbook doesn't show over here that I went through in class, because I hope it helps, that there's some, if we think about the rest of the world over here, and they happen to be trading beer at $15, that market price, the world price, ends up getting reflected back into your local market. And then that tells the rest of the story. At $15, and here's your picture from the textbook, you'll just have something like this. Suppose the world price is $15. Are you going to be exporting or importing? Exporting. So the quantity supplied by German beer producers is that amount. Unfortunately, the beer drinkers of Germany aren't going to be so thrilled with this international trade business because the price of a liter just went up, right? So consumers are going to end up buying less beer because the price is higher. And so German consumers are going to buy that amount. And so the rest of this is going to be exported to the rest of the world. And now Germany's a player in the world market. Okay, so some other country out there might end up being the importer. So Mexico over here, they had a domestic situation that led to $8 cervezas, right? I'm sorry, I kind of did that a little backwards, didn't I? Let me just start over. We have expensive cervezas up here at $20 a cerveza, and that $15 world price is cheaper than what Mexico was able to crank out. And so at a world price of $15, Mexican consumers are going to want to buy this amount, the demand, and they're going to want to, the Mexican producers are going to cut back on production. They did not have a comparative advantage, so they're going to be importing that amount of beer from the world market. Now, where we got into trade restrictions is we say if Corona and some of the other beer manufacturers in Mexico get together and lobby their politicians and say, hey, wait a second, we're losing jobs here. Can't you see that we used to be at this level of production? This whole international trade business has taken away a lot of jobs. We need some help. We need some protection. Well, we could tax that German beer before it comes over into our territory, right? We could say, hey, there's only a certain amount of German beer that we're going to allow into our country. So that's where we get into these trade restrictions. And so within each country, if they're able to tax that beer at $3, or let's say $2, if they add a tariff on that amount, then the amount of imports is going to fall. This horizontal distance is less than that horizontal distance. The price in Mexico is going to be higher than what it is around the world. Around the world, if it's a free market, they're still enjoying beer at $15. But you come to Mexico, and you're going to find beer prices are up at $17. Okay, because of the tax on it, the extra special tariff. All right, so then we went through some things showing how these two policy instruments can be similar, but then can also be different in terms of tax revenue. With a quota, there's no money that the government collects if it's just a pure quantity constraint. With a tax, the government's going to collect $2 on each one of these units that end up coming still across the border. All right, questions or comments there? Thought I'd spend a little more time on that since that's the oldest material. So, main things to focus on. Chapter 2 and or kind of as we slide into 15, the U.S. and Japan production possibilities. That's the big model of Chapter 2 and 15, a blend anyway. Chapter 15 really focuses on this material, trade restrictions, taxes, quotas, different types of policy instruments. We roll into Chapter 4, and we really start macroeconomics. So we looked at real GDP, inflation, and unemployment over chapters 4 and 5. These are the big three that we're going to talk about the rest of the semester. It's real important that you understand how these things are measured. GDP was the dollar value of all final goods and services, and we had two ways to measure that, one being the income approach and one being the expenditure approach. Which one was cigarettes? Expenditure approach. So if we look at spending categorized into consumption of households and investment by businesses in new machinery and equipment and new home purchases by households, money that the government spends on weapons of mass destruction and other things, C plus I plus G, and then finally, I don't have it shown here, but net exports, what we sell to the rest of the world versus what they buy from us. So net exports, that's one way to think about GDP. The first thing we looked at was why they're equal to each other. What we spend on stuff, our spending that we do, is equal to the income we earn on the things we buy. Because all of those products, every penny can be allocated in theory to some resource. This wouldn't be here if there wasn't a pile of scarce resources that were devoted to its production. Land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. That's the only way this came into being. So the $1.56 that was spent on this thing was spent by somebody, but we can take every penny of that $1.56 and trace it back to here. It was somebody's pay. It was some payment to a plastic manufacturer that then paid their employees and then paid their rent on their commercial building, right? Every single penny of that sale can ultimately be traced back in the resource market to somebody's pocket in the form of income. That gives us our two approaches, the income approach versus the spending approach. Those two things are equal to each other. Two different ways to think about GDP. GDP, in its generic form, was the current level prices of a given year. We later called that nominal GDP, was equal to the sum of the value of all goods and services. So if we were looking at 2006 data for nominal GDP, we take 06 prices and 06 quantities, we add them up, and that's what it was for 2006. But as we track the economy over time through these ups and downs, it's not fair to say, well, we did really good this year in 2008. We did really good compared to 2006 because GDP was higher. The flaw with that is not recognizing that we don't really give a rip about prices. We care about the stuff that we have, right? So we need to separate the price effect and the quantity effect. So we went through creating that index of numbers, that price index, and by selecting a base year and going through that tool, we were able to separate out those two effects, which then, of course, gave us inflation, the percentage change in that price. So now we've got a price effect and a quantity effect. Real economic growth is on the big three. That's the quantity effect. So we got our Q identified here. We got our P identified here. All of that ties back to nominal GDP, our original measure of economic activity. Now we've got it filtered into these two important effects for macroeconomics. And then the last thing we looked at was that special resource that we hold near and dear to our heart. Probably a little more near and dear to our heart than a computer and a machine and a piece of land. We've got a human being that's behind this production process in some way, shape, or form. That human being might be the entrepreneur, might be the CEO, might be the janitor, might be somebody, but there's a human being behind that, and that's what unemployment starts to look at. To look at what are the effects on that very important resource L. What is in that L bucket? Because that one we think is pretty special, because there's other aspects of L that are different than a lump of coal that we throw into the machine to help get the engine going, right? So we pay special attention to L, and that's why it rounds out our big 3 list. Okay. Questions or comments on the material? All right, take note. You're getting let out early today.